You're listening to the Today's Eden podcast, episode 24. This is where the struggles are real, the callings are heavy, the kids are sticky. We come together because it takes a village, and this is your tribe. Hey guys, thank you for listening to the Today's Eden podcast. I'm so happy that you tuned in to this episode because today we're talking about a little something different, and I want to give you a warning or a disclaimer right now. If you're listening in the car with your kiddos and they are not napping, I would really suggest you consider the topic or turn it off and wait to listen to this episode at a different time. Today we're going to be talking about the female anatomy. And so if your kids are awake right now and you're listening, this would be a good time to either pause this episode and wait another time that they're asleep in the car, or you have another chance to listen. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and tell you about this episode. So today's topic is vaginismus. And if you don't know what that is, if you've never heard that word before, I urge you to listen in, because odds are we probably know somebody who's going through something like this and they didn't know that it had a name. They didn't know that it was a thing or an actual condition. And so my hope is that if you're experiencing this, or if somebody we know is describing these symptoms to us, that we can maybe point them in the right direction. And that is the whole point of supporting each other as a village, right? So on the show today, I have Marnie Scott, and she was so gracious to share her personal story with vaginismus and how it affected her marriage and intimacy and just her life and the things that she had to overcome. And it's really good, you guys, and I'm so grateful for her to come forward and be willing to share such a personal experience. I hope that you enjoy this episode, and I hope that we are bringing more awareness to vaginismus so less women have to live in silence with this condition. Hey, Marnie, thank you so much for hanging out and talking with me. I'm so glad that you're willing to come on the podcast, because someone had contacted me and suggested that I cover what I feel is a really important topic. And it's about a condition that many women silently suffer from called vaginismus. And I had read that about 2 out of every 1,000 women, I think it is, that suffer from it. But obviously that only accounts for the people who have documented that they have it, or, you know.
I would be willing to bet it's a much greater number. It's so in the dark, and it's kept so secret and silent that I think that the majority of women that suffer from it probably are never diagnosed and are never treated. Mm-hmm. And so obviously then they wouldn't be counted in the number that are suffering from it.
Right. Yeah. So before we talk about and get into what vaginismus is and all that, could you tell us a little bit about you and your family?
Sure. So I'm 31. I have been married to my husband since 2008. I'm an Orthodox Jew, so when we dated, it was more of a traditional dating rather than the typical American way to date. There was no physical contact between us before marriage. I was super excited to get married. I was looking forward to our intimate relationship. And after that whole vaginismus journey, which I'm sure we'll get into, I now have 3 children and I'm pregnant with my 4th. So it's kind of come a long way in our marriage since then.
Yeah. And if you do know about vaginismus, which once that this was brought to my attention, then I started to do a lot of research about it. Having kids and being able to be intimate is like a huge accomplishment and like a huge deal. And so when I heard that, you had 4 kids, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's so awesome. And just that I've learned so much about how much it can affect your relationship with just, you internally, and so much more if you have a significant other or somebody that you're dating, or, and so, yeah. So first, could you tell us a little bit about what vaginismus is for those that don't know?
Sure. Vaginismus is almost an involuntary tightening of the pelvic muscles. So it's not something you control, just like you can't control your heartbeat. You can't force your heart to beat faster. You can't force your heart to stop beating. It's involuntary. It's very painful. It's any kind of any kind of, I'm trying to think of the word, like insertion into the vaginal area causes pain. So it could be a speculum if you go to the OBGYN. It could be actually having intercourse. It could be, having to use an applicator to apply some kind of medication. Any of those things, any one or multiples of those things would be vaginismus.
So how did you first learn or realize that you had it, or did it take a while for you to actually like pinpoint what it was that you were going through?
It was kind of a journey because, like I said, I got married. I was a virgin, and so when I first got married and we were kind of struggling, to consummate our marriage, I got a lot of advice, it takes time. Have some wine. You're too tense. You need to relax into it.
Yeah.
And so I tried all those things, and they are, I suppose, good advice, although not really great for the situation I was in. But I started, the longer that went on, the more isolated I began to feel because I realized that other people were not struggling the way I was struggling. They might have needed to relax and it might have taken a little while, but not like what I had.
Right.
People weren't in pain the way I was in pain. And so, then I was told, you're probably having some kind of relationship issue. And we were, but more because of this vaginismus issue than anything else.
Yeah.
And so we tried, different therapies, and we went to marriage counseling and all these different things. And I was told a lot of really incorrect information from therapists, doctors, friends. It really was a therapist who happened to say, maybe just talk to your OB. Now, I didn't have an OB at the time because I had moved. I had moved when I got married, and so I didn't have a gynecologist I was seeing yet. And I looked for one, and the one that I happened to get into just by, I don't know, divine grace was a woman who wrote the foreword of a book about vaginismus. And so when I sat down to talk to her, and I'm just sobbing in her office because there's something wrong with me. My marriage was falling apart.
Yeah.
I was in pain. I was a mess. And she was able to say, you should borrow this book for me and just read it and call me when you're done. And when I read the book, it was eye-opening. And that's the book, A Private Pain by Dr. Ross Tabasel and Dr. Dietza Katz. And I read the book, and it was shocking. I also had never heard of this condition. Nobody had ever mentioned it to me in any of these conversations with therapists, doctors, friends. Nobody had ever said, there is this little known condition, or there is this, medical thing. Nobody mentioned it. The other doctors I had seen didn't mention it. And I think it's just very misunderstood that people didn't realize how, the different ways it could look. And so when I called back that GYN and told her I read this book and it was eye-opening, she got me in touch with the doctors who wrote the book. And that was where they have the Women's Therapy Center in Plainview, New York. And that was where I ended up being treated.
Yeah. How did you feel like that moment when things started to kind of like align, where you were reading the book and then you're like, could, make the comparison connection of what you were feeling between what they were saying in the book? How
it was relief. It was relief because it was the first time I had heard anything that had made sense to me.
Yeah.
I was tired of people telling me I didn't love my husband. I was tired of people telling me if I really wanted to do it, I could do it. I was tired of people telling me that there's something wrong with me, or there's something wrong with my husband, or maybe he doesn't love me, or maybe he's not patient enough. When I knew those things weren't true, but people kept saying them, they start to take root in your head.
Yeah.
And so reading this book that says it's not your fault, it's not your spouse's fault, it's not anybody's fault. Just like if you had a heart condition, it wouldn't be your fault. It's just there, was just a huge sense of relief. And then I made my husband read the book, and he also felt very similarly when he read it and was like, this is what we're experiencing. And I didn't realize how much he was suffering along with me, not being able to solve this problem or solve this difficulty in our relationship.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about how you kind of communicated having this like roadblock in intimacy with him without making him feel like he was at fault or like that he was being rejected. Because I know that, when they're trying to pursue you and, and then you can't explain what's going on, there's this disconnect and confusion. And so how did you guys communicate and kind of work through that?
So our communication has improved drastically actually going through this. I think our communication is significantly stronger, having had to suffer through this and then figure out. We didn't even know how to talk about our intimate life. And honestly, I don't know that many people do,
Yeah.
because you don't ever have to.
Right.
So it's not something you talk about, you just have it.
Yeah.
And that's great for people. But for us, because we had to do far more talking than we did action, it was really hard. I didn't know that in his mind at the time, he had a timeline for like, this is it. If we get to this point and things are still not better, or at least on a track, then this marriage is just not going to work out. And I didn't know that at the time. I found that out much later. I'm glad I didn't know that at the
Yeah.
time. But I could see where he was going, because to him, he was very frustrated. He felt, he felt like helpless. I mean, the same way I felt, but he wasn't experiencing it the same way. And so that made it very difficult. And besides for just being, the beginning of a marriage in general,
Yeah.
which is difficult,
Yeah.
it just was it was a new part of our lives. And it took a lot of, through our treatment at the WTC, at the Women's Therapy Center, they did work with us on that, how to talk about things, what to say, what kind of language to use. And that helped a lot in our communication, because really, you're right, that it was really, really difficult.
How did you handle that yourself mentally and emotionally?
A lot of tears.
Yeah. Yeah.
There were a lot of tears. That first year of marriage was a lot of crying.
Yeah.
Originally, I used to call like my sisters or my close friends that were newlyweds, and kind of talk it out with them, only to realize that I was so different and so off the spectrum that I stopped, because I realized it actually was counterproductive. I wasn't getting anywhere. They didn't know what I was talking about. And then I just was on my own. And that, I think, was the hardest part, of feeling totally alone. Nobody knows. Nobody knows what I'm going through. And even when I tell them, they still don't know what I'm going through. There's nobody to help me. And that was really hard to process until I finally got this help, which is why I think the sense of relief was so extreme.
Yeah. Wow. And there is such a great gift in like having that community. And man, like when you do feel isolated, it is like so heavy and like so hard to deal with. Like when you're inside your own head and you're thinking, is it me? And is there something wrong with me? And what, you're having all these like what if questions, and is it, me questions. And that can be like a really tough battle that can spiral really deep if you aren't careful.
It was one of the reasons that I feel like, I know many women don't like to talk about this. It's private. They're embarrassed.
Yeah.
It's hard to talk about. And I feel like the more I talk about it, the more likely I am to reach somebody who really needs help and feels alone. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like the more people I can tell, it's a little embarrassing to me, but I think at this point I've kind of gotten over that. Yeah. But I just feel like even if it helps only one more person or two more people, it's two more people that are no longer suffering alone. Mm-hmm. And even if they can't get the help right away, at least they know they're not the only ones in the world. They're not broken. They're not defective women.
Yeah.
They're just suffering from a medical condition.
Yeah. So if you don't mind talking about it, so what do the treatments look like? How do you and your husband work towards this goal of creating, an intimate relationship between each other?
So as far as the treatment goes, the place that we were treated has two different types of treatment. They have a 2-week intensive treatment for people that are traveling. People travel from all over the world to go there. Australia, South Africa, Europe. I mean, people just come from all over. And then they do a 2-week intensive treatment. And I don't know a whole lot about that, because I happened to be lucky enough that I was living on the East Coast at the time. And I was nearby, and I would travel there, once or twice a week, sometimes with my husband, sometimes alone. There was a lot of body treatment, how to engage with my body, how to understand these spasms, and a lot of also mental treatment, because there's a lot of anxiety that goes along with it. And there's a lot of anxiety that influences your physical self, even though your anxiety is mental, that influences it. And so I had to work through those anxieties, those fears myself. And so it's a dual treatment, and it's individually geared to every person, which is part of why I think they have such a high success rate.
Yeah. Because
again, it's not a blanket thing. Women come into, because some of it is is mental and psychological. Women come with all kinds of baggage when they start this. Sometimes women have had a sex life that's been fine, and only after having some kind of, let's say, traumatic birth or something like that, find that they're suffering from this. So, because every person comes in so different or at a different stage of life, different backgrounds, different cultures, the treatment has to be very, very personal.
Yeah.
And I like that they understood the culture I was coming from. They were very well read. They knew exactly what I was talking about, so that I wasn't trying to explain the nuances of things and things that would confuse doctors and stuff, where it just became more complicated to explain it than just to forget about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there's kind of that gap when you go to just a normal physician, where they just want to look at the clinical side of things, but there's the whole personal part that they're missing that is, I think, a huge window to a lot of the things that we do go through or feel. And from what I've read, the Women's Therapy Center has done like an amazing job of bridging those gaps and connecting those two and helping. I mean, I'm kind of baffled that like when I Googled vaginismus and they are the top people that show up for treatments, and I'm thinking, like, if all these women are going through this, then how come there isn't more options out there than this one place, or why aren't other people learning from these women? Yeah.
A lot of physicians say that they treat it or understand how to treat it, and there are other online resources. Self-treat your vaginismus. Order this kit and try it. And for some women that works, and that is great. It's obviously much less expensive.
Right.
It's obviously much more convenient. But I would say that probably for the majority of women, because it's so complex, it's not easy to self-treat. And a lot of doctors, some of the doctors I talked to, they're like, oh yeah, that was once mentioned in a medical class. That's kind of a problem, And so they're like, yeah, I can treat that. But really, they don't even fully understand it to the point that they can treat it, despite being, very successful in whatever, gynecological care their medical degrees in.
Yeah. And when I was thinking about this, and like how you said that it can be kind of like more like a mental anxiety, like a psychological thing going on with like a physical reaction, I think that, even if you aren't going through vaginismus and you've never heard of it before, that you can still relate in some way, in that, just like you can have an argument with, your husband, then we are all wired a certain way, and we, there's trigger points that we have that make us respond a certain way. And so I feel like when I think about this, that's sort of the same playing field, is that for whatever reason, you have that trigger point that when this happens, that's what your physical reaction.
I would agree with that, especially because it's so involuntary. It doesn't matter how relaxed you are or how, any of those things, you're not controlling it, just like you're not controlling your heartbeat. You're not, telling it beat faster, beat slower, making it constrict. It just does it on its own. And so I would agree with that there are certain things to every person, sensitive things that, a word that just sets them off or whatever it is. And it is kind of like that, obviously to kind of a deeper degree. But I think that everybody can understand, just because women in general tend to be more in tune with their emotions, tend to go through cycles, tend to, go through highs and lows, especially when you talk just hormonally, that they understand what that's like sometimes, to go like, something's not working for me, something's off.
Yeah. Do you find that now that you have kind of been through this journey, that you could find more women who have been through it, or do you still find that a lot of women still just don't talk about it?
I find that a lot of women still don't talk about it, but what I have found interesting is that I talk about it with people that I think it would help. So especially in my community, people that generally have these conversations with newlyweds or, premarital counseling. I came, when I moved back to my hometown, I live in Wisconsin. And when I came back to my hometown, I told all those people, like, here's what I went through. Here's what helped me. Here's what didn't help. Pass this on, pass on this information. And I've gotten calls back from them that said, there's somebody, she called me. Can you answer a couple questions for me? Would you be willing to talk to her? And so I do feel like the message must be getting out there somehow. People must be finding out about it. And even if it's a slow trickle, it's a trickle down effect. So the more people I tell, and hopefully the more open they are, the more people they will tell. And it doesn't have to be so shrouded in secrecy, but generally our intimate life is. And so it ends up that way. But I'm hoping I have heard people that said, you know what, I contacted the Women's Therapy Center, or, I did some research online, or I called my OB about this, that I'm having this problem, which makes me really happy
Yeah.
that they're hopefully getting the help they need.
Yeah, and I think that the more that women speak up about it, then the more that like physicians will have to be made more aware of it than just we heard about it that one time.
Yeah, I would like to hope so.
Yeah. If somebody listening relates to the symptoms that we're talking about, and they think that they might possibly be experiencing vaginismus, what would you say would be some first steps they need to take to find help?
The first thing I would actually have them do is read the book of Private Pain, because it describes the symptoms so much better than I can. It has so many different scenarios because people experience it so differently. Mm-hmm. It has so many different scenarios that even if you're like, well, I go to gynecology exams just fine, and I'm able to use, vaginal medications, and I can do all these things. It maybe you are able to, it doesn't mean you don't have it. And that book has so many different examples of how it can manifest that it's a good first step just to say, do I relate to this at all?
Yeah.
Just on a personal level. And from that point, if a person says, you know what, I really do, there are so many things that make me feel like I am suffering from this. I would either suggest they call their OBGYN and talk it over with them. But if they feel like the answer is not satisfactory, I would actually get in touch with the Women's Therapy Center. They're very open. They have emails. They have phone numbers. They're available. And they're perfectly happy, meaning my first reach out to them was an email that said something along the lines of, I read your book. I think I have these symptoms. What do I do? And they were super friendly and so helpful in kind of guiding me through the process of what to do next and figuring out even if this is even what I had.
That's good. I feel like that this, it just like you said, it can manifest in so many different ways that just like anything else, it's not a one size fits all, issue to where, like you said, you can use a tampon and it not bother you, but there could be a trigger when it comes to intimacy that you went through that you didn't realize is affecting you, that's
right,
causing your reaction. Was there anything that you experienced that you felt like might have caused it, or was it just something that just you realized happened when that point of intimacy
So I don't
came?
think there was any kind of trigger for me. I did have one therapist, she was convinced that I must have been sexually abused as a child. I mean, she was convinced. She couldn't get over that. It just kept coming up again. I'm like, I wasn't, but she was so convinced that I started to like look back at my childhood and go, maybe am I forgetting something? But that's like crazy. I mean, then I started to think I was going crazy.
Yeah.
Like, this is not, it wasn't, she sent me to an EMDR specialist. She's like, don't worry. She'll figure out what memories you're suppressing, which by the way, were none. I wasn't suppressing anything. And it was the EMDR specialist who told me, you don't have any trauma in your past. I didn't think I did, So she was the one who told me, she was the first person to say to me, you're coming to me and I can't help you. This is not what I do.
Yeah.
And so I was really appreciative for that, since I was paying her out of pocket. And she said, you can stop coming. This is not going to help you. So I don't think there was any trigger point, especially because I did understand my body. I had been wearing tampons since I had gotten my period as a teenager. The idea of, sex wasn't foreign to me before I got married, although it was, obviously I was a virgin when I got married. But I don't think there was a specific trigger point. I do know that I was anxious. I did have, an internal anxiety, but it had never been so strong. It just kept my anxiety got worse the more my vaginismus got worse. So it was almost cyclical.
Yeah.
And that was really hard. But I don't think there was any, at least for me, there was nothing in my past that was very triggering.
Yeah. How did your husband support you through this? And what was his role through it all? And how did he react once he found out that?
So at the beginning, it was very hard. He did have some really wonderful mentors to talk to. And it actually was originally his mentor that said, this doesn't sound right. Your intimate life is supposed to be pleasant and enjoyable for both of you. What you're experiencing is not normal. He was actually the one that sent us to the first marriage counselor. Mm-hmm. And so he did have people to talk to, which helped. And I felt they were very supportive of just a strong marriage. Yeah. They just wanted us to be happy. How did he support me? He has never ending patience, I think. He's way more patient than I am. And as I was going through therapies and stuff, he reassured me constantly. I needed constant reassurance, and he did.
Yeah.
Constantly reassure me, this is okay. We're working on it. We'll get there. I don't know that he felt that way necessarily inside so much, but I never saw it on the outside, that he really stayed very patient with me. Especially once we were in a therapy that was working, and he saw like there will be a light at the end of this tunnel. This will eventually work.
Right.
I think especially at that point, as you start to see positive results, it increases positive behavior.
Yeah.
And so I think that helped a lot.
So how can we support other women who are going through vaginismus? Like, how can we create conversations and not say the things that you were told? And,
I think the best thing, if somebody comes to you and says, they're struggling with an issue, hear them out.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing I would say is, what do you think the issue is? Before, guessing, going like, well, when I drink a glass of wine, I was, so much more relaxed and I felt, so much better. Those kinds of, immediately when you address somebody's experience and you make it your own, you've already lost them.
Yeah.
When you inquire about their experience in particular and you start to ask them questions rather than give answers, I think that increases the dialogue. And so, when I hear somebody's having a hard time and I say, well, what things have you tried? Has anything worked? What things do you know for sure didn't work? I find that the questioning technique is a lot more helpful in creating the dialogue and finding out, trying to pinpoint an issue. Meaning the issue might be, I'm so stressed all the time and I'm so tired all the time.
Yeah.
That this is just so difficult. Or the issue might be there's some kind of emotional abuse, or the issue might be, any multiple number of things. But when we start to listen rather than give answers or, try to draw it into ourselves so that we feel like that's relating to them. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, when I did this, it helped. But really, that's not necessarily helpful to them. You need to hear what they're saying before responding yourself.
Yeah. I've actually I personally had to dial that down too, because I used to do the same thing to others and trying to help them see how I could relate. And I did it in a way that I felt like was making them feel less alone. Like I wasn't trying to make less of their situation or say that I knew best or I knew the way or the solution, but just to help them feel less alone. But, in doing that, I would realize later on that I was really doing, what you were doing, and kind of, it wasn't helpful. It wasn't helpful.
Right, and we think it will be because it kind of, in our heads, it makes sense. Like, we don't want them to feel alone. So here's what I did. See, You're not alone. We both have this. But really, they're going, yes, but you're not fully understanding the nuances of what I'm talking about.
Right. And
so that's where the disconnect comes in.
Yeah. And I think that motherhood was like the one thing that kind of really pointed that out to me, is that you get so much unsolicited advice when you become a mom. So then, now I'm just like, okay, I'm not going to say anything.
Right. And how many times people tell you you're sleep training your baby wrong. You hold them too much. You don't hold them enough. You don't love them enough. You don't discipline them enough. Until you're like, you don't live my life.
Yeah.
You don't know what I'm doing.
Right. Yes. Yes. And thanks to Facebook, the solicited advice is never ending.
Yeah. Yeah. Between Facebook and the internet, it's done wonders for that.
Yes. So how are things now between you guys? I mean, you guys now have 3 kids and a baby on the way. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And
I would say our marriage is very strong. I would say it's stronger than a lot of people's, because going through something like this difficult and coming out the other side, I think that this can either make or break a relationship. Mm-hmm. It's so hard and it's so difficult, and there's so many difficult things that when you come out the other side, you either have just fallen apart, it's just crumbled, or you have figured out a way to make this cement your relationship together. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true with any hardship that a family goes through. If they, have a child that's ill, or a parent that's really sick, or any of those kinds of things, I think it's the same kind of idea. It can either, cause your marriage to crumble or strengthen it. And I think for us, it really strengthened it so that we communicate better. Mm-hmm. And I think that when we have a difficulty, and, it's definitely not perfect. I wouldn't say, we never get in a fight, or, never give each other silent treatment, or never get angry. But I think that we have more tools to manage those things.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of those tools came from, these treatments and the fact that we know that we can make it through difficult things together. We know that we've done it in the past, and so we can do it again now. And I think that helps a lot.
Yeah, definitely. Um, I was thinking something, and then I was just like, that was awesome. What you were saying was awesome. And then I lost my train of thought. Um, yeah, what was I gonna say? Let me. We're talking about that. Okay, I don't remember.
It'll come to you in the middle of the night.
I know. And then I'll wake up and think, dang it, I
And you'll
didn't
be like,
ask her.
oh, I remember what I was going to say.
I know. Um, it was a really good question though. I really wanted to know the answer to. Oh, okay. So, since intimacy is such a deep thing between, a husband and a wife, and it creates deeper connection. How did you guys through this time kind of show your love for each other or create that connection in the in-between before you were at the end of the tunnel, so to speak?
So it was really hard. And I think that my husband is far more physically affectionate than I am. And so I think it was especially hard for him
Yeah.
because I had so much anxiety surrounding our intimate life in general that even simple acts of physical intimacy, kissing or, a back rub or whatever, caused me so much anxiety that I couldn't even do those. And so that made things very, very difficult. And the longer it went on, the longer I was suffering, the worse that got. So even if he would come and put his hand on my shoulder, I would tense up. Even though, I mean, that's like really innocuous. You do that to your friends all the time.
Right.
But it was it was so difficult. And so maintaining that connection at that time was really hard. I did actually read a book at the time, which totally transformed the way I think about my relationships in general, with him and with others. And that was called The 5 Languages of Love.
Yes. I was going to ask about that.
It's probably one of the best books I've ever read. As far as relationships go. First of all, it's a fast read.
Right.
But what I thought was so interesting was it taught me so much about things that my husband needed from me that were not necessarily natural for me to do. And he read it as well and realized that the things that I needed from him were not the things natural for him to do. And so in order to support the other person, we had to speak their language. We had to actually, when I realized oh, he needs physical affection, it doesn't have to be some complicated thing.
Right.
It can just be a hug. It can be something simple. And when I could wrap my head around that, that helped. That helped then as well. It also helped, times, when you think postpartum and you're not feeling well and you're so tired and, there's nothing you can do about that. And you still have to maintain your marriage and you both have to be parents and you're tired and you're working and you have to do those things. Having that connection in your head of going, this doesn't have to be complex. We have to keep it simple and we have to figure out what makes the other person feel like they are the most important person in my life. And that I think, like I said, the first year of my marriage, I don't think we did such a good job of that. But having come through this, I think we've come a long way in making sure those things get done.
Yeah, we definitely didn't. We read that book too. And I think it was somewhere towards the middle-ish or end of our first year of marriage. And when we read about the 5 love languages, it was just like the universe exploded. And we're like, whoa, what? Like, there's different ways to love each other.
It's been fascinating for all my relationships. Forget the one with him. I mean, he was like, wait a second, I think I understand my mother better. Things like that, which totally, it's just the idea of how people perceive the other people around them and how they express themselves to the people around them. And I think that we just assume people are like us and they're not.
Yeah. And I'm so glad. That's so crazy that was the book that you had mentioned, because earlier when my husband and I were talking, and I really, usually when I do interviews, I want to ask questions not only for the women, but for the men, to get kind of like the both sides of, what, to figure out what to ask so I can know like who, the sides of both of what everybody was feeling. And he is also, his love language is touch or, physical affection. And so I was trying to put myself in your shoes, and that like, well, if I was going through this, how would I show my husband affection if, if for me, I'm anxious about intimacy, and if I feel like kissing will lead to one thing to another, and that's what I'm trying
Hmm.
to, and that's what's causing the
That's, I think, what
anxiousness.
made it so hard is that that is his language. His language is physical touch. And so now knowing that, it's fine. But at the time, there was nothing I could do to express that. And so the only thing I could do was use the other languages to express myself as best I could. And like I said, luckily he is endlessly patient with
Yeah.
me because I think that was the part that made it so hard for him is that he couldn't even, it didn't matter how many times I said I love him or
Yeah.
I tried to show him or I did things, whatever it was that I did, it wasn't his language. So although he could understand it and yes, realize that I'm saying it and I'm being honest, he wasn't feeling it that same way. And I think that was really difficult for him. I think that was probably the part that took him the longest to, get over, as time went on. And, as we hit this cure and I'm feeling so much better and I'm feeling so much more confident and he's still feeling like, okay, but there's still a lot of growth that has to go on so he can realize that I really do love him and I
Yeah.
really want to be with him and I'm happy in our marriage and all those things. And so that was really hard. That was really hard.
Yeah. Do you think that there's anything that can be done when, like having conversations about sex and because, you get like this 8th grade talk and it kind of doesn't, it just kind of scares you, but it's like this scary video about like what can happen. But I feel like that there's this sort of like conversation that needs to happen, that it's like the reality of like what to expect, but also that it's a good thing, and so it's not a scary thing. When like when I have the conversation with my daughter, sure, I would love her to wait, but I also don't want her to fear it. Like I don't want, you know what I mean?
Right. I think that part of it is we need to be more honest with our daughters and our sons really about
That's true.
all the parts of their growing up. I did have a funny conversation with my kids when in my last pregnancy. My kids at the time were 4 and 2, and they would come to me to all my appointments. And so at one point they were looking at the ultrasound and they asked me what was going on. I said, there's a baby in my tummy. And my daughter, who was 2, said, "You ate a baby?" She was like shocked. And so then of course I realized like, okay, this is going to be a conversation I didn't think I was having yet. And what I explained to my kids was very simply, mommies have a uterus and that's a separate place where a baby grows. It's not in my tummy. Tummies are where food goes. Uteruses are where babies grow. And it was that simple. It was very simple. But to the point where now, like one of my kids, one of their friends said, "Oh, your mommy has a baby in her tummy?" I'm like, "It's in her uterus." I'm like, "Oh God, I'm gonna have to explain this to this kid's parents." But I feel like the more kids know when they're younger in age appropriate language and age appropriate topics, the less taboo it's going to be, so that when they are confused or they do have a question, they're not ashamed to come and ask you. They're not afraid to say, "I'm confused about something," or "Can you explain how this happens?" And I think then as they get older and they try to make these complicated choices, they have the tools to do it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise they get older, they find out all this information, they don't know how to process it, they don't have anybody to talk to other than their friends. And let's be honest, their friends have less accurate information than they do. And so, it just becomes this jumble of misinformation, which only is going to increase anxiety and possibly increase problems. And I feel like the more we start our kids young with real basic things, calling their anatomy by its proper name, things like that. And again, not overwhelming them with information. We don't need to get into details when they're, 6 years old. But as they get older and they ask questions, being really honest with them, not trying to hide the truth. And yes, sometimes telling them, "I will tell you when you're older, I promise." And then actually doing it when they get older so that they realize it's not a secret. It's just private.
Yeah.
And distinguishing between those things for them.
Yeah. And I
I
think
think would help a lot.
I think that's also helpful also for them to be proud and like have ownership over their bodies, like that it's not something that like, yes, like these, you have a chest and of course like you don't show it to everybody, but it's not to be ashamed of, like, because I feel like you, in doing something good, we can actually kind of do it in such a way that it's confusing to them, to where it's like, oh, well, like this is never supposed, to where it can come off
Like
the wrong
put
way.
on a shirt. You cannot walk around like that.
Right.
I have to tell my kids, we don't leave our bedrooms naked. Things you don't usually think you're going to have to say, sentences we don't assume that we're going to use, but things like that. It's even the simple things, when kids learn to touch themselves and they realize like, oh, that feels good. They're really little when they learn that. And if you tell them, "Don't do that," or "Cut that out," or "We don't do that in public," they start to feel ashamed and they're confused. Whereas if you tell them, "That's something we do in private, usually the places we're in private are a bedroom or a bathroom. Choose one of those places.
Yeah.
It's very simple for them. It's not something to be ashamed of. You're not yelling at them so that they, think that they're doing something wrong. It's just, we don't do that in the living room.
Yeah.
We don't, there's all kinds of things we're going to have to say to our kids, sentences we never thought were going to come out of our mouth.
Right.
And those are some of those, and that's okay. It's okay to tell your kids that, but also to be honest and calm as we do. I mean, I appreciate my oldest is a boy, so I know my husband's going to have the talk with my son before I have the talk with my daughter. So lucky him. But I think that's okay to, to be honest with our kids, to use their, their proper names for things. So that also, even if they just have a medical problem, what if my daughter got a UTI and didn't know how to tell me where it hurt? And she's trying to tell me her tushy hurts, and I can't even figure out where she's in pain.
Yeah. And
she's trying to tell a doctor, and she doesn't even know how to describe it. We need to give them the language that they need to be able to do those things for themselves. And I think that starts very young. And when it starts young, the shame doesn't show up the same way. It's just a private thing, not an embarrassing thing.
Yeah. Well, I just want to acknowledge you real quick before we move on to the rest of the questions that I had, but just that I'm so grateful that you messaged me and contacted me in response to me looking for somebody to talk to about this, because like you said, a lot of people don't talk about it. And I feel like you stepping forward is just awesome for other women who are experiencing.
I'm happy I was able to help.
Yeah, I mean, especially like you said, if one person is out there and they can relate in some way, or, and that, like I said, when we were talking earlier, is kind of the whole purpose for this is to get back to that, it takes a village. So we're not feeling isolated in struggles that often like a lot of other people are actually feeling, but because we don't talk about it, we don't know it. So, yeah, I appreciate you sharing your story. So I wanted to ask you, what is the most influential book that you've ever read?
I couldn't say the most influential book that I've ever read. I really like to read, so I've read a lot of books. Probably the most helpful book I've read is that 5 Languages of Love book, just because it has changed the way I view other people in general. Yeah. People that I meet, people that I talk to, and even in a work relationship where you understand why some people respond to you better. Than others, and how to make others respond to you. And I think that has changed the way I interact with people. And so, although maybe not the most influential, it definitely influences a lot of the things I do now and makes me behave differently than I did before.
I definitely agree. I think that has been like the number one, when I asked this question, that has been like the number one most,
oh, really?
Yeah. Most, like, so many people have brought that book up. And I think it is because it helps us to really understand other people and how they show us that we care. Because we all think that we have the same way of showing that we care. And so we assume that different. Because it's not the same way that they don't, but in reality they do. They're just doing it in a totally, different way.
The other book that I read that probably has influenced me pretty strongly is I read Parenting with Love and Logic.
Oh, yes.
And I find that the same way that the 5 Languages of Love help me interact with other adults, and I guess also with my kids, Parenting with Love and Logic has really given me a different relationship with my children, of understanding why they do the things they do and how then to react in such a way that will be productive,
right,
as opposed to counterproductive. And so I feel like they almost, although they're not the same at all, in the way that I treat other people and react to other people and other children and other adults, I feel like those 2 books probably about the same.
Yeah. If you could empower women in one way, what would it be?
I wish women in general realized their own strengths, rather than, women oftentimes feel like they have to step back. They feel like when they push themselves to the forefront, or they are at the forefront, it's showy, it's arrogant. And I wish women saw that strength is a positive thing. It's not arrogance. It's not abrasiveness. I did one time have somebody just like, you're so abrasive. And I was like so offended. And then I realized, maybe it's not such a bad thing.
Yeah.
To be out there and put themselves out there and show that it's not arrogance. They really are great. They really are wonderful. And when people start to see that, they will become more confident and in turn then more successful at whatever they're trying to accomplish.
If you could tell your younger self one thing, assuming that she would listen, what would it be?
Um, I guess the one thing I kind of regret not doing, so I would tell myself to do it, would be take more risks.
Mm.
I wasn't a big risk taker. I was bullied in elementary school a lot. And so when I went to high school, I was like, this is not going to happen again. I will fit in. And I did. And that was great. And I had really good friends. But I think if I hadn't had that, situation, I might have tried new things. And I wish I had. There were a lot of things, and now I look back and say, I could have done that in high school. I could have tried that thing. I could have, not that it would have necessarily changed where I ended up, but I wish I had told myself, take more risks, put yourself out there and see what you can do.
Yeah.
That's the time to try things out and experiment. And I was not a risk taker. So I kind of wish I had been, not major risks, but small things.
Yeah. I think that many would say that you're kind of a risk taker now being on a podcast. Lots of people will not come near me with a microphone.
Really?
So,
I like in general, I like to perform. So I don't mind public speaking and stuff like that. But there were a lot of things, things I had been told that I believed about myself as I was younger that, I wouldn't put myself out there for. So, I really wanted to try out for the dance group in my high school, and I never did. I was like, I can't dance. Only now as an adult realizing, I actually am coordinated. I probably could have done that. And it would have been cool to try out that new thing. I don't have that chance to do that now as a grown up, but that time is over. So I wish I had taken some of those more risks, or, been less of I was a very big rule follower. I never got, like the teacher said, don't do something, so I didn't. Yeah. Whereas really in the scheme of things, it would have been okay. It would have been okay to blow off a homework assignment once in a while and go out with friends. So, I wish I'd done more of those things, but in the big scheme of things, it's not a big deal, but I wish somebody had told me that.
Yeah.
I wish I'd listened to that.
Yeah. There's actually a woman that I am going to be interviewing in a couple days, and she wrote a book called The Gutsy Girls, and it's actually for young girls, but I read it first and before I gave it to my daughter, and it is exactly that. It's about instilling that gutsiness and that bravery in young girls when they're little. Yeah, so it made me think of that, and just that, even I kind of see some of those things in my personal life that, I wish I had done this, but why was I so afraid? Like, what was I afraid?
What did I think was going to happen?
Yeah. And so she talks about that. So it just reminded me of just ways that, it's a really good book. But but you still have lots of time. You still have lots. I mean, I've
got plenty of things crazy. I plan to try to do. I took on a new job this summer, and the more I think about it, I'm like, gosh, I was crazy to try something new like this. But you know what? What's the worst thing that's going to happen? It's not going to work out the way I had in mind. I don't do it again, whatever it is. But if I don't take the chance, how am I ever going to know? And I want my daughter to see that also and see it's okay to take risks and try things. It's okay to try things and fail. And it's also okay to try things and see that we can be successful.
Yeah.
So I want her to see that and to realize that happens to her mom and that it can happen for her.
Yeah. Well, I think you're an awesome, amazing woman and an awesome, amazing mom. And
thank you.
Thank you so much for being on and talking to me about this. And I think that, it's definitely going to have an impact. And I'm so grateful for that and for you to share your story and hopefully bring hope to others.
Well, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. And I think you're doing a great thing here. So I'm really grateful that you had me on here.
Wow. I hope you guys enjoyed that episode. I felt like I learned so much from Marnie and so much from all the research that I did. If you want to find the links to the therapy center that Marnie went to, the books that she's talking about, check out the show notes for this episode at todayseden.com/podcasts, PODCASTS/024. And there I will have all the links of all the things that we talked about, so that if you feel like you might be experiencing some of these same symptoms or somebody might be experiencing these, you can point them to the right direction. And that is always what we want to do, is help each other out. If you have not tried Audible yet, I highly suggest it, as it is a mom's dream. You'll be able to listen to a book via your phone and not have to worry about holding it or sitting still while trying to read, which is obviously impossible for most of us moms. Also, you get your first book free. So if you wanted to check out a private pain that Marnie talked about or the 5 Love Languages book, you can get your first book free at audibletrial.com/Today's Eden. Also want to make sure that you guys are checking out the Today's Eden Tribe Facebook group. You can go to today'seden.com and go to the top menu bar, click Today's Eden Tribe, and there you can join our Facebook group where we kind of hang out and talk about real stuff just like we do on here, but with each other. Lastly, if you've been listening into this podcast and you've been enjoying it, I just want to let you know that I truly appreciate you, and I honestly want to get to know every single one of you, so I hope you do join the Facebook group. But I ask that you share this podcast with your friends or your family, anybody who you think that might benefit from joining us in the conversations that we're having, whether it be on the podcast or in the Facebook group. And I also would love it if you could leave a review or rating on iTunes. You guys, that is how people can find my podcast better, is by giving it a rating, so that way iTunes makes this podcast more visible on the podcast lists, and in turn, more women get to hear these awesome stories from these awesome women that are sharing their journeys on this podcast. And the quote I want to leave with you today is, if you're in a dark place today, that's okay. Even if you can't get out of bed and all you can do is breathe, take all the time you need. We'll be here when you're ready. Every day is a battle. Some days you'll demolish everything in your path. Others you'll hold on for dear life. Either way, you are a warrior. Never forget that.